Welcome to AutoSuccess Cyber Corner, the podcast for auto dealer cybersecurity. I'm Kyle Alexander, and this is episode 2, Tabletop Exercises.
This podcast is brought to you by Proton Dealership IT. When your team is focused on selling and servicing vehicles, who is focused on keeping your systems secure? With a 24/7 365 operation, Proton can monitor, detect, and respond to potential network or cyber issues. Sleep easy knowing your dealership is covered.
I'm joined by Sean Patronis. He is the Director of Information Security at Reynolds and Reynolds. Also joined by Greg Uland. He is the Vice President of Marketing with Reynolds and Reynolds. Guys, thank you for joining me today. All right, so for starters, it's kind of obvious, but I want to make it clear, preparation for cyber attacks is crucial for protecting car dealerships. So maybe talk a little bit about how can dealers build a plan for a worst-case scenario cyber attack?
Sure. So, tabletop exercises are a great way to plan for a worst case scenario cyber attack. Tabletop exercises are a discussion-based role-playing activity where you get the right people together in a group and discuss their roles and responsibilities during an incident. It's a good way to plan for your disaster recovery, incident response, or business continuity functions for your business. So you're basically going to go through and check through all of your policies, procedures, and staff and make sure they have the right tools at their disposal to respond to an event.
Yeah, when you think about the items that kind of need to be checked off, there's quite a few, obviously, and some of them are technical, which Sean's going to be more equipped to touch on than myself, but some of them are communication plans as well, right? So how do you communicate to all the stakeholders involved what's going on and what the remedy is? So how do you communicate to your customers? How do you communicate to your employees? How do you communicate to other stakeholders in the business and even to the regulators if needed, to the government? So that's a big one, is really documenting, okay, what is our plan? What is our cadence if something does happen? What are our bullet points that we need to hit in our communications? Sean, a couple of other things maybe you could hit on from a more technical perspective. What needs to be on that checklist as you're going through that tabletop exercise of, okay, what do we need to have a plan for?
Sure. So I think it depends on your scenario that you're going to design for your tabletop exercise. So let's say you're going to design for a worst case scenario ransomware event. So the types of items that tabletop exercise is going to go hit is they're going to look for your backup plans, your recovery plans. How do you get new hardware brought in? How do you talk to your third parties, maybe your third party IT or cybersecurity services? How do you contact those folks? How do you get involved in with the business? Who's leading the communication for the business? Who's leading the recovery parts of the business? And who do you go to for certain items? So it gets everybody on the same communication page. It lets you verify and validate your plans that you've designed are in place and they're working, and everybody knows how to follow them.
So we kind of started talking a little bit there about some of the pieces needed to be involved to protect against a worst case scenario. Maybe let's dive into some more of those specifics. Maybe you were touching a little bit on who needs to be involved in this. Maybe you definitely touched there on communication between customers and the public, but what kind of information needs to be reported in when you're preparing against a worst case scenario for your tabletop exercise?
Yeah, so let's start first with putting a pin on who. I mean, it starts with the dealer, right? The owner of the dealership needs to be involved in this conversation. Ultimately, that's where the conversation needs to start and end. But, other parties that need to be involved, certainly your IT team, whether that's internal or external, you're going to look to, or you should certainly involve your legal team and counsel in this discussion as well. There are certainly potential legal implications. You want your broader leadership team across the dealership. Any type of communications folks that you have, whether that's a marketing role or just your general manager, or whatever your situation is, you want to make sure your communications folks are involved in this to craft these messages in the most appropriate way. So it's really getting your team together and kind of checking those boxes and making sure that you have the right people in the room, starting with the dealer for sure. And then, thinking about how to really communicate this and what that looks like is a big part of the conversation. And, ultimately, the decision on that needs to take into account all the circumstances. You're not going to be able to kind of have something that you pull out of a drawer and plug and play when something like this happens. But what you can have is a template, right? You can have bullets, you can have a checklist. So you're going to need to take in the circumstances of the specific situation. But as a general rule, it's best to communicate frequently, consistently, and factually whenever something like this happens. So ensuring that you have that plan ready to go so that you can be quick and responsive when something like this, or if something like this happens.
I'll add to what Greg said here. I'll reinforce. He said, you need kind of your guided bullet points, what to go through. It's not every scenario or instance the same, and that's why it's good to have a plan, and then also perform these tabletop exercises to kind of figure out, okay, what do we do if this happens? What do we do if that happens? So it's a ransomware event this time. Next time, maybe it's a different event that doesn't involve the breach of personal information or something like that. And that type of event and recovery exercise may be different. It could just be a disaster recovery exercise. Your business gets hit by a tornado. How do I recover my business? So that's a different type of tabletop exercise, not necessarily on the security side, but on the IT side. So those are going to involve different people and different communication channels, different vendors, different insurance companies potentially, right? If it's the cyber insurance might be different than your general liability insurance. So it's important to have a general plan and then test it with these tabletop exercises that are very specific.
So maybe how should dealers run through these tabletop exercises?
Yeah, and Sean hit on this pretty well earlier. Maybe you can add a little bit, Sean, but it's getting every stakeholder in the room. I mean, everybody needs to have a voice. Everybody needs to understand their role. And these tabletop exercises are a safe environment to think through things and potentially make mistakes and figure out the right way to do it when something happens. So getting everybody in the room where everybody can think collaboratively and support one another to make sure that you have the best plan in place is the first thing. And making sure that you document it is the second thing, right? You don't want to do one of these things and everybody walks out. We've all been in that meeting where you have this really productive meeting and you come out of it feeling great, and then nothing ends up getting documented. And a week later or 2 weeks later, you feel like, man, what were we going to do after that happened? That's the biggest mistake you can make in these situations. You're taking the time to do these tabletop exercises, document, because that's what you need in a year or 2 years or 4 years when this happens. And then I would say the last thing, at least from my perspective, and then Sean, I'll let you add anything in, is making sure that this is on the calendar at least annually to review this. You put a plan together, but you don't want it to get stale. Things change, right? The stakeholders change, your business changes. So you need to make sure that you're reviewing this at least annually and doing these exercises at least annually too.
Absolutely. Just to reinforce everything that Greg said there, you're designing these tabletop exercises to give you, feedback on what you're doing and if you're doing it right, how you can improve, and giving opportunities for your staff to learn and grow and potentially fail at certain parts of the exercise, so you don't have those failures when it really matters. And agreed, documenting everything afterwards, creating a plan to go address those issues. Hey, I didn't put my lawyer or legal counsel on the contact list, and I needed to for this scenario. Let's make sure we have his information documented somewhere. So, and then potentially figuring out that you don't have the coverage that you might thought you needed. So maybe you need to work with your IT team or security team or your vendors to close a gap that you have and that you didn't learn until you did the tabletop exercise.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for joining.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was a good conversation. Really appreciate it.